The street looked normal. Houses lined up in perfect rows, lawns trimmed, driveways clean, mailboxes shining in the late afternoon sun. To any stranger passing by, this neighborhood looked peaceful, like a picture from a brochure. But behind the curtains, behind the smiles, something darker lived here. The homeowner, an ordinary person who only wanted peace, had started to feel it weeks ago. At first it was just a strange sound at night, a faint crunch of footsteps on gravel, a shadow moving past the window. Then came the letters, not in the mailbox, but slipped under the door like secret threats, each one stamped with the HOA's logo, each one colder than the last. Violation notice. Final warning. Failure to comply will result in fines. But the violations made no sense. The mailbox was the wrong shade of black. The grass was half an inch too long. Even visitors, friends stopping by, were called traffic disturbances. It felt less like rules and more like a game of control. Soon, a board member began circling the property. Clipboard in hand, camera phone raised, he walked by again and again, as if searching for flaws invisible to the human eye. Sometimes the homeowner would catch him staring, writing things down with a strange satisfaction. Then the emails began. At first one every few days, then every day. Each one sharper, more threatening. They spoke of fines, hearings, even possible legal action. The tone was not just official, it was personal, like someone on the board wanted to break the homeowner's will. The air around the house grew heavy. Even inside, the homeowner felt watched. Every sound outside carried suspicion. Every knock at the door made the heart race. What did they really want? Why this house? Why this person? Neighbors started whispering too. Some avoided eye contact, afraid to be connected. Others leaned in quietly and said, "Be careful. Well, they don't stop until you give in." The homeowner realized this wasn't about grass or mailboxes. This was intimidation, pressure, control. The HOA was playing a dangerous game, one designed to scare, to isolate, to crush anyone who dared to resist. But what the board didn't know was that this homeowner was not like the others. While the HOA spied, the homeowner gathered. While they wrote threats, the homeowner collected. Every letter, every photo, every violation notice was stacked neatly in a folder. Every strange sound in the night was recorded. Every neighbor's quiet story was remembered. The intimidation only fueled something stronger, a plan. The HOA thought they were hunting prey. They thought their power was unquestionable. They thought the homeowner would eventually kneel, pay the fines, and disappear into silence. But in the stillness of the house, under the glow of a single lamp, the homeowner smiled faintly. Because the HOA had no idea what was coming. Something big, something sharp, something that would flip the entire board upside down. And when it happened, this quiet little neighborhood would never look the same again. The first official strike came on a grey morning. The homeowner opened the mailbox, expecting nothing more than bills and ads. Instead, a thick white envelope sat on top, sealed with the HOA's logo. The letters on the front looked sharp, almost like they had been pressed into the paper with anger. Inside was the notice, cold, direct, no greeting, no kindness, just accusation. Violation. Your mailbox does not meet community standards. Failure to correct this issue within 7 days will result in a fine of $200. The homeowner stared at the page, confused. The mailbox? It was the same black metal box that had stood there since the house was built. Solid, clean, perfectly fine. Yet here it was. The first warning, delivered not as a suggestion, but as a threat. The language felt less like rules and more like war. Words like non-compliance and disciplinary action filled the letter, making the homeowner's name sound like the name of a criminal. Whoever wrote it didn't just want change. They wanted fear. That evening, neighbors began to whisper, On the sidewalk, near driveways, by the fences, quiet conversations drifted on the air. "They did the same thing to the Thompsons," one voice murmured. "Yeah, and remember Mrs. Allen? They fined her for a garden gnome. They always pick someone new. Keep the pressure on." The homeowner listened, piecing together the pattern. This wasn't about the mailbox. It was a ritual, a test. The HOA picked targets one by one and pushed until people broke. Most gave in quickly, paying the fines, repainting, replacing, obeying. But a few had tried to fight back, and those stories never ended well. The homeowner folded the notice carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it on the kitchen counter. For a long time they stared at it, the words echoing in their head. A single piece of paper, yet heavy enough to shift the entire air in the house. But beneath the weight of that warning, something else stirred. A flicker of defiance, a voice whispering that this was only the beginning. If the HOA wanted a fight, they had just taken the first shot. The mailbox notice was only the beginning. Within days, more letters appeared. First one, then another, then a steady stream. Each envelope was thicker, each page colder than the last. Violation not corrected. Fine, $200. Additional violation? Grass exceeding length limit? Daily fines may apply. Final warning. Immediate action required. The homeowner lined them up on the kitchen table. Row after row of white paper, like soldiers marching into battle. It was clear now. The HOA wasn't just reminding. They were attacking. The tone of the letters grew darker. Words like serious consequences and further legal steps filled the pages. One notice even threatened a lien on the house if the fines went unpaid. It was no longer about a mailbox or grass. It was about control. Then came the knock. It was late, well past dark, when the sound echoed through the hallway. 3 sharp knocks, deliberate and heavy. The homeowner froze. Few people visited at that hour, and none knocked like that. Opening the door, they found a board member standing on the porch. His face was stern, his eyes sharp. In his hand, a clipboard, the same one he carried during his endless walks around the neighborhood. "You've had your warnings," he said, his voice calm but dripping with power. "If you don't comply, fines will increase daily. You'll leave us no choice." The air between them felt heavy, like a storm pressing down. The homeowner's heart raced, but their face stayed still. No anger, no fear, just silence. Finally they spoke, their voice steady. "I've read your letters." The board member leaned closer, lowering his tone. "Then you know what comes next." With that, he turned and walked away, his shoes crunching against the gravel, leaving behind an echo that lingered long after he was gone. The homeowner shut the door and locked it, standing in the quiet house with only the pile of letters for company. The pressure was real now. Letters, threats, knocks at the door. The walls felt closer, the nights longer. But deep inside, the homeowner made a choice. They would not react with anger. They would not shout, argue, or give the board what it wanted. Instead, they would watch, wait, and prepare. The HOA thought they were tightening the noose. But with each threat, with each visit, they were only pushing the homeowner closer to something they would never expect. The letters and late-night knock were only the start. Soon the pressure turned into something far more unsettling. The homeowner began to notice figures lingering at the edges of their property. Board members, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, strolling past with clipboards and phones in hand. They walked slowly, pausing to snap photos of the yard, the driveway, even the cars parked in front. On one afternoon, a camera clicked as a friend stepped out of their car to visit. It wasn't inspection anymore. It was surveillance. Each time, the homeowner pretended not to notice. But inside, the feeling of being hunted grew stronger. Curtains fluttered as eyes watched from across the street. Conversation stopped when the homeowner walked by. It was as if the whole neighborhood was being turned into a stage, with the homeowner as the villain of the show. Then came the emails. Neighbors began receiving messages from the HOA board. The subject lines were sharp. Community standards under threat. Non-compliance spreading. Urgent attention needed. The messages painted the homeowner as reckless, careless, someone who refused to respect the rules everyone else followed. Words like repeated violations and disturbing behavior were used, dripping poison into the minds of anyone who read them. By design, the emails weren't just about rules, they were about reputation. The board was trying to isolate the homeowner, to turn neighbor against neighbor, to make them an outcast in their own street. For many, the plan worked. Sidewalk smiles became fewer. Conversations turned into short nods and quick exits. A few neighbors avoided eye contact entirely. But not everyone believed the story. Some whispered quietly, "They did the same thing to me once." Others slipped small words of encouragement when no one was watching. The whispers confirmed what the homeowner already knew. This wasn't about one house. It was a pattern, a cycle of fear. Still, the harassment was real. The constant clicks of cameras, the stares from across the street, the emails filled with lies. It was enough to break anyone's nerves. But not this homeowner. Every photo taken, every letter received, every email spread across the community was carefully recorded. Screenshots were saved, copies were filed, dates and times were written down with precision. What looked like harassment to the homeowner became something else, evidence. The board thought they were tightening the trap. They thought fear would crush resistance. But the homeowner's silence was not surrender. It was strategy. And while the HOA gathered photos, the homeowner was gathering proof. The kind of proof that could change everything. Weeks of spying, letters and whispers built toward one moment. The envelope that arrived this time was heavier than all the rest. The HOA logo glared from the front, bold and sharp, as if the paper itself carried judgment. Inside was not just a warning, it was a demand. Fine imposed, $5,000. Failure to pay within 10 days will result in legal action, including the possibility of a lien on your property. The words burned off the page. This was no longer about grass, a mailbox, or visitors. This was the board pushing with full force, daring the homeowner to break. Neighbors heard about it almost instantly. Some gasped at the number. Others shook their heads in silence. Around the neighborhood, conversations stirred like wind before a storm. They'll have to pay. No one fights the board that long. 5,000? That's how they trap you. They know people can't risk court. This is it. Either they give in, or they lose. The pressure was everywhere. In the mailbox, in the sideways glances, in the heavy silence of each night. The HOA believed they had won. Their fine was designed like a hammer, big enough to crush any thought of resistance. The homeowner stood at the kitchen table, staring at the paper. It sat on top of the growing pile of notices, thicker and more threatening than the rest. For a long time, they didn't move, didn't speak. The tension in the air was sharp, almost alive. But fear never came. Instead, something else filled the room. Calm. The HOA expected panic. They expected anger, shouting, maybe even tears. They expected someone to run to the bank, desperate to pay whatever it took to make the threats go away. But this homeowner didn't move the letter to the trash, and they didn't write a check. Instead, they slid the fine into their folder, right beside every other notice, every photo, every email. The folder was thick now, heavy with paper, heavy with truth. Neighbors kept watching, waiting for signs of collapse. They whispered, "Will they fight? Will they leave? What's their move?" But the homeowner gave nothing away. Only silence. Only patience. The board thought the story was ending. In truth, it was only reaching its peak. And soon, The surprise waiting in the shadows would turn their power upside down. The $5,000 fine could have been the end for most people, but instead of breaking, the homeowner began to move quietly, carefully, as if each step had already been planned long ago. One evening, when the neighborhood grew quiet and the streetlights flickered on, a handful of neighbors slipped into the homeowner's living room. The curtains were drawn, the lights dim. It felt almost like a secret meeting, because in many ways it was. They came in whispers at first. The Thompsons, who once had been fined for a small crack in their driveway. Mrs. Allen, who had been targeted for her garden gnome. A young couple who had been told their holiday lights were unacceptable. Each one carried their own story of unfair treatment. At first the room felt heavy, filled with anger and frustration. But soon, something began to shift. One by one, they shared their stories. Each violation, each fine, each humiliating email from the board. The more they talked, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't random. This was power used as a weapon. The homeowner listened carefully, then reached for the thick folder on the table. They laid it open for all to see. Pages of letters, photos, printed emails, screenshots. Every detail had been saved. Every move of the board recorded. Gasps spread across the room. "You kept everything?" one neighbor whispered. The homeowner nodded. Every word, every threat, every time they stepped too far. Hope flickered in the room. For the first time, the neighbors realized they weren't alone. They weren't just isolated victims. Together, they were witnesses. Then came the reveal. Calmly, the homeowner explained their plan. They would not simply pay the fine. They would not bow to threats. Instead, they would take all of this, every piece of evidence, every story, every voice, and challenge the HOA where it mattered most, in front of the law. The room fell silent. The idea was bold, dangerous, but it was also the first time anyone had spoken of fighting back in a way that could truly matter. Slowly, nods spread around the room. One neighbor offered old letters. Another promised to testify. A third pulled out their phone, showing photos of their own harassment. Piece by piece, the pile of evidence grew, taller and stronger. By the end of the night, the air in the room no longer felt heavy. It felt electric. For the first time, the board wasn't the hunter. For the first time, the board was the one being watched. The homeowner closed the folder with quiet confidence. The plan was set. The HOA thought they had forced surrender, but what they had really done was unite the very people they had tried to break. And soon, the board would learn what it felt like to be on the other side of intimidation. The night of the HOA meeting arrived. Folding chairs filled the community hall, neighbors gathering in uneasy silence. The board sat at the front, their papers neatly stacked, their voices sharp as they whispered among themselves. They expected another easy night of control, announcements, warnings and orders no one dared to question. But tonight was different. The homeowner walked in slowly, a thick folder tucked under one arm. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. For weeks, everyone had been waiting, whispering, wondering how this story would end. Now, the answer was walking toward the front of the room. Without raising their voice, the homeowner placed the folder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was louder than words. The board shifted uneasily, their eyes flickering with the first signs of doubt. Then the homeowner began. One by one, pages were pulled from the folder. Letters, each one stamped with the HOA logo. Dates read aloud. Threats highlighted. The words were no longer hidden in private envelopes. They were exposed under the glow of the hall's lights. Next came the photos. Not only the ones the board had taken, but photos of the board themselves, lurking outside houses at night, snapping pictures of guests, trespassing too close to private yards. Murmurs spread through the room. Then the emails, projected on the wall for all to see. Lines filled with twisted words, accusing the homeowner of crimes that never existed. And finally, the testimonies. Neighbors stood up, one after another, voices steady as they shared their own stories. The Thompsons, Mrs. Allen, the young couple, each speaking, each confirming the truth. The board's faces grew pale. What had once been their weapon, paper, letters, rules, was now turned against them. The audience was no longer silent. Whispers rose into outrage. Heads shook in disbelief. They can't do that. His is abuse. They've gone too far. For the first time, the board looked small. Their power, built on fear and silence, was slipping away. The community's eyes, once filled with hesitation, now burned with anger, not at the homeowner, but at the board itself. The homeowner never shouted, never raised a hand. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. The truth was clear. By the time the folder closed, the room no longer belonged to the HOA board. It belonged to the people. And everyone knew the board had finally met their match. The room buzzed with noise, voices rising in anger and disbelief. The board members huddled together, whispering quickly, trying to regain control. One of them finally stood up, clearing his throat. This is all being taken out of context, he stammered. The board has every right to enforce the rules. These so-called complaints mean nothing without proof. The homeowner didn't flinch. They reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a small stack of papers. Calmly, with steady eyes, they said, "Proof? I already filed everything with local authorities 2 weeks ago. Every letter, every photo, every recording." The hall went silent. The words hit harder than any fine, any threat, any knock on the door. Gasps spread across the room. Neighbors leaned closer, wide-eyed. The board members froze, their faces drained of color as the truth sank in. The homeowner hadn't just prepared for tonight. They had been building a case all along. A ripple of applause began, soft at first, then louder as more neighbors joined in. The people who once stood silent under the weight of fear were now clapping, cheering, standing. The board had no choice. Within days, fines were erased, the threats stopped. And soon after, some members quietly resigned, unable to face the shame of being exposed. The HOA that once ruled through fear was left fractured, its power broken. The homeowner was cleared of every violation. The mailbox stood untouched. The grass grew as it always had. And friends came and went without cameras lurking nearby. The neighborhood, once divided, now began to talk openly about reforms, about taking back control from the few who had abused it. But the story didn't end there. As the crowd celebrated in the meeting hall, the homeowner revealed one last detail. From the very first night, when footsteps echoed outside, when the first letter slid under the doors, where they had started recording, every sound, every visit, every word. Hidden microphones, security cameras, time-stamped logs. The homeowner had been documenting everything, building a shield of truth that the board could never break. The twist sent a shock through the room. The HOA, masters of intimidation, had been watched themselves the entire time. And as the homeowner looked around at their neighbors, faces no longer afraid, but proud and united, they knew something had changed forever. This wasn't just a win. This was the moment the community woke up. And the HOA would never intimidate them again.